A pilot climbs into the cockpit of a fighter, knowing one thing for certain: he is never coming back to land on this ship. The summer of 1941, the North Atlantic, a wide, empty stretch of ocean that no British fighter can reach from shore. The German crews of the long-range Focke-Wulf Condors, flying with the 40th Bomber Wing, call this place simply the Gap. Here they drop down to low level, guide the submarines onto the convoys, and sink ship after ship with nothing in the air to stop them. Between August of 1940 and February of 1941, Condors alone send more than 85 ships to the bottom. Churchill called this aircraft the Scourge of the Atlantic, and he was not exaggerating. Britain answers in a way no one had answered before. On the bow of an ordinary merchant ship they build a catapult, and on that catapult stands a single Hurricane, launched by an explosive charge with a force that can break a man's neck, and with no chance at all of landing again. Wherever that aircraft goes after the fight, it is never returning to the ship. The German crews were certain this emptiness in the sky would stay empty for a long time to come. Their calculation was wrong, though the price of that mistake would take a while to become visible. Britain had found an answer that looked doomed to fail from the start, and the meaning was hidden inside that very hopelessness, in a way that not every side of the war would work out. By the end of this video, you will know exactly why Britain built aircraft by the hundred that were meant to be thrown away after a single flight, why the pilots called this work a one-way ticket before they ever launched, and why a single rocket flash from a merchant ship could turn a bomber away from a convoy before one shot was ever fired. Before we go further, a short question for you. Many of you had someone in the family who lived through that war, a father, an uncle, or a grandfather who served in the Navy, in the Merchant Marine, in the air, or sailed in the convoys across the ocean. Write in the comments who it was and where they served. These stories are worth keeping while they are still remembered. And now, let us go back to where all of this began, to the idea of putting a combat aircraft on a ship that has no runway for it. To understand why Britain went to such a desperate measure, you first have to understand what this gap was and why it could not be closed the ordinary way. The coastal air forces of Britain and Canada could cover convoys within a few hundred miles of their own shores. Beyond that began a zone no land-based fighter of the time could reach. The Condor, with a range approaching 2,000 miles and a flight time of 14 hours, was the one aircraft able to sit right there in the very middle of the ocean where no one else could fly. It began its life as an elegant four-engined airliner built for peaceful transatlantic flights. It met the war in military paint, with bombs under its belly where the passenger seats had been. And the Condor killed less with its bombs than with its own eyes. It would find a convoy, ride alongside at a safe height, radio the position back to headquarters, and toward the spot it marked, the submarines would come. To destroy it or drive it off meant saving the whole convoy behind it, not only the one ship it happened to be shadowing in that moment. October of 1940 showed this in full, before the first catapult ship even existed. A wolf pack of submarines, guided onto convoy SC-7, sank 20 ships, totaling around 79,000 tons in a single operation. The aircraft overhead dropped not one bomb on that convoy. It did not need to. It simply showed them where to look. For the sailors on the decks, It looked almost routine, and that made it worse. A far-off speck on the horizon, 4 engines, an aircraft that hour after hour simply held its distance, neither closing in nor leaving, out of reach of the anti-aircraft guns. Everyone aboard understood what that speck meant. Somewhere beneath the water, the submarines were already turning, fed the course and speed of every ship in the convoy. All that was left was to wait for night and the first torpedo. The cost of this blindness was measured in more than fear. Between August of 1940 and February of 1941, Condors alone sent to the bottom a cargo totalling more than 360,000 tons, bound for Britain across an ocean she physically could not cover from the air. Every ton lost meant steel, food or fuel that never reached an island already dependent on imports for nearly everything. Before the war, Britain brought in around 22 million tons of food a year by sea, close to 2/3 of everything the island ate. By the middle of the war, that figure had fallen almost by half, and the difference was measured in every home by the ration on butter, meat and sugar. And the cargo in the holds of these convoys was more and more often American. From the spring of 1941, under Lend-Lease, tanks, aircraft, trucks, canned meat and aviation fuel crossed the Atlantic, built in the factories of the United States and bound first for Britain and later for the Soviet Union through the northern ports. Every ship, a Condor, guided onto a submarine, might carry the equipment an entire army was waiting for at the other end of the route. The hole in the sky over the middle of the ocean was a hole in the supply of a whole war across several fronts at once. Full escort carriers, able to keep a real fighter screen over a convoy, were something Britain barely had in 1941. They could not be built quickly. Extending the reach of a shore-based fighter to the middle of the Atlantic was physically impossible. What was needed was a solution that could be put to sea right now, however crude, however disposable. The first converted ship was the Michael E., a dry cargo vessel fitted with a catapult and a single Hurricane in the spring of 1941. On the 28th of May, she sailed on her first voyage from Belfast, part of a convoy bound for Halifax. The system, meant to protect her, had not yet been flown in real conditions. The first trial launch from a catapult only took place on the 31st of May, from the deck of the Empire Rainbow, flown by pilot officer Henry Davidson. The Michael E. had put to sea before that day. On the 2nd of June, south of Cape Clear, the German submarine U-108 put a torpedo into her stern. The ship went down that same evening. Her fighter never once left the deck. The first ship of the new program was lost before it could prove the idea worked at all. The device itself was crude to the point of brutality. On the bow of the merchant ship, they set a lattice ramp with a trolley. An explosive charge drove that trolley, detonating in a cylinder and pushing a ram with enough force that the fighter reached flying speed in a fraction of a second, off a deck only a few dozen meters long. The load on the pilot at such a launch could injure him before he ever met the enemy. That load on acceleration was no abstract line from a technical manual. Those few seconds down the rails felt like a blow no one could prepare for in advance, except through a training course ashore. Around 2 weeks and a handful of practice launches, and the pilot was declared ready for a flight, whatever it turned out to be. There was almost no regular flying practice after that. The weeks of waiting aboard ship were not filled with training sorties, so as not to risk the one working fighter on the vessel. The pilots who went through it described the launch in a few words. For several seconds, the body is pressed into the seat back with a force you can neither meet nor soften. The grey deck jumps forward in a rush, and then you are already in the air just above the water, the ship behind you. The sensation, they said, was truly thrilling right up until the moment you got used to it. And the only way to get used to it was to go through it once again. And here is the difference from any other combat aircraft of the time. This fighter had no way home. The ship it launched from had no runway, no arrestor wire, no way to take it back. Whatever happened in the air, whether the fight was won or lost, the aircraft had only two outcomes left: reach the nearest shore, if there even was one within range, which almost never held true in the middle of the ocean, or set down on the water beside the convoy and hope someone reached the pilot before the Atlantic did. And even that second outcome, ditching beside the convoy, was merciful only on paper. The water of the North Atlantic drained a man's strength in minutes, even in summer, and in the Arctic convoys, at the edge of the ice, a man in a life jacket stopped being able to move before a boat could reach him. A pilot who set his aircraft down perfectly and climbed clear of the cockpit could still fail to survive rescue simply because the sea was too cold. The escort ships knew this and drove toward a downed flyer as fast as they could, often under the very air attack he had just shielded them from. Remember this. The aircraft was written off the moment it was placed on the catapult, before it had even seen the enemy. We will come back to this all the way to the end. Even the choice of the fighter itself was part of the same calculation. The Royal Navy had looked at a naval version of the Spitfire as early as 1940, but the idea was dropped by direct order from above. The few Spitfires that came off the line at all were needed by the home squadrons, not by a disposable experiment on a merchant deck. Instead, the fleet got the early model Hurricane, already outdated by 1941 for a fight against the newer German fighters, and withdrawn from frontline squadrons. By January of that year, the Hawker Company had an order for 50 conversion kits for exactly those machines, worn out and cast off from combat units. The fate of the aircraft matched the fate of the ship that carried it. Both were ready for the scrap line before they ever met the enemy. On the 5th of May 1941, at Speke, near Liverpool, a unit was formed under the modest name of the Merchant Ship Fighter Unit. They took volunteers, and among them were plenty of veterans who had already come through the Battle of Britain, men who knew the price of air combat firsthand. Each of them understood the terms of the bargain in advance, and the terms were not hidden. If you were launched and shot down your enemy, you had a chance an escort would pick you up. If they did not, if you missed the convoy, if the water was faster than the rescue boat, you had bought a one-way ticket. That is what the pilots called it themselves, before the first launch. Each ship kept 2 pilots who took turns on watch in a cabin right by the catapult on days when the risk of attack was higher than usual. Weeks could pass between alarms, weeks in which the fighter stayed on its rails without a single flight. The pilot lived beside a weapon that could become his last at any moment, and he did not know in advance whether that would be in an hour or 2 months into the voyage. To the rest of the ship's company, the pilot was an unusual passenger. He did not answer to the merchant captain, and stood no ordinary watch, and all that was asked of him was to sit and wait for an alarm that might never sound the whole voyage. The sailors who shared a table and cramped passageways with him for months understood one simple thing. If that alarm did sound, this particular passenger's odds of coming back aboard were lower than any of theirs. Before the idea was handed to the merchant fleet, it was tested on their own. The Admiralty converted 5 ships to the same catapult Hurricane: the Pegasus, the Maplin, the Patea, the Springbank, and the Ariguani, but manned them with their own crews and a Royal Navy pilot. These were warships with the same device on the bow. If the idea was going to fail anywhere, or work first anywhere, it would be here. The cost of merely testing the idea turned out to be high. The Patea was bombed on the 28th of April 1941 during trials before any real combat. The Pegasus, the oldest ship of the group, built back in 1914, was simply pulled from the fleet by summer, worn out. The Springbank was torpedoed by a German submarine at the end of September that year. The Ariguani was hit a month later, and though she made Gibraltar, she was lost for further service. Of the 5 ships on which the idea was proved, only one lived to see a victory in the air. On the 3rd of August 1941, the Maplin was in the North Atlantic, covering a convoy. The lookouts spotted a familiar silhouette, a Condor holding at a respectful distance, circling, passing coordinates, doing exactly what the German crews had been doing for months without the slightest opposition. The pilot of the Hurricane was Lieutenant Robert Everett, a volunteer reserve flyer. 12 years earlier, he had won the Grand National, the country's greatest steeplechase, riding a 100-to-1 outsider named Gregorlac, that no one had backed with a single pound, and beating the favourite by 6 lengths. Now he sat in the cockpit of a fighter that was about to launch with no way to return. The charge under the deck went off. The trolley was flung forward, and in a fraction of a second the Hurricane was in the air, climbing toward the stranger, who clearly had not expected to meet an enemy here. The fight ran long. Everett came in again and again until he had fired off his last round. The Condor trailed smoke and fell into the sea. For the first time in history, an aircraft launched by an explosive charge from the deck of a ship had shot down an enemy in the air. The victory still had to be survived. Everett set the damaged fighter down on the water, and the radiator broke on impact so sharply that the cockpit was dragged several meters under before he could climb clear and reach the surface. The destroyer Wanderer picked him up. For that fight, Everett received the Distinguished Service Order. The idea was proved. A disposable fighter, launched from the deck of an ordinary ship, really could stop the aircraft that until this moment had treated the sky over the middle of the ocean as its own private space. Proving it on 5 warships with trained Royal Navy crews was only the first step. Far harder was to hand the same catapult, the same charge, and the same one-way ticket to ordinary merchant ships with civilian crews who had never trained for war at all. That is exactly what Britain did. By 1943, 35 merchant ships had been converted to the catapult Hurricane. They were manned by the merchant fleet, civilian sailors who had spent their lives carrying cargo and never prepared for a fight. The only serviceman aboard such a ship was most often a single pilot, sleeping in a cabin by the catapult and waiting for the alarm. It is worth pausing for a moment on who actually sailed these ships. The British merchant fleet lost more than 30,000 men killed over the war, and the proportion of dead among its sailors turned out higher than in any of the regular armed services of the kingdom. These were civilian crews, stokers, engine hands, deck hands, many of them no longer young, many who had spent their whole lives at sea. They carried cargo across an ocean crawling with submarines, for a wage that, by the rules of the time, stopped being paid the very day the ship went down under them. And now, among the sacks and crates of ordinary sea cargo, there stood a catapult with a combat fighter on their deck. Of these 35 ships, 12 would later be lost themselves, sunk on the way across the ocean, never getting the chance to send their single fighter into the air. It had already happened to the Michael E. on the programme's very first voyage, and the same fate waited for the Empire Hudson, the Empire Rowan, and several other ships of the same class over the next 2 years. On the 26th of April, 1942, the Empire Morn sailed from the Scottish port of Oban, part of an Arctic convoy bound for Russia. Aboard, beside the catapult, was a flyer named John Kendal. He had joined the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve back in April of 1939, before the war. In the autumn of 1940, on his 20th birthday, he was posted to 66 Squadron in the thick of the Battle of Britain. 4 days after arriving with the unit, he shot down his first aircraft, and at the end of October that year, he added another to his tally. By the time he volunteered for the new Untested program of catapult fighters, he already had dozens of combat sorties over England itself behind him. On the 25th of May, on the return leg, German aircraft began coming in on the convoy. Kendal was launched. He drove off a reconnaissance flying boat, then attacked one of 2 torpedo-carrying Junkers 88s and shot it down. His fuel was running out. He was ordered to bail out beside the destroyer Badsworth. The parachute did not fully open. At such low altitude, that was enough. Kendal struck the water and suffered injuries no one could survive. He was pulled from the sea quickly, but he could not be saved. He became the only pilot of this unit to die after a combat sortie, one he had already won before it killed him. Just 2 days later, on the 27th of May 1942, another convoy was fighting in the same Arctic waters off Bear Island, heading the other way. Kendal had died returning home. Now convoy PQ-16 was steaming toward Murmansk, and in its ranks moved another catapult aircraft. From the deck of the Empire Lawrence, they launched Pilot Officer Alistair Hay, South African by birth, a volunteer of the same unit. 2 catapult launches in 2 days on opposite courses in the same frozen corner of the Barents Sea. Coming at him were 6 German machines at once, Heinkel 111s and 115s, running in on the convoy with torpedoes. Hay attacked alone, shot down 1 bomber and damaged a second before enemy fire raked his cockpit and wounded him in the thigh. Bleeding, he bailed out of the damaged fighter and dropped into the icy water of the Barents Sea. The destroyer Volunteer had him aboard in under 10 minutes, though during the rescue itself, the ship remained under attack and had to weave through it in the middle of the operation. Hay received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The ship he had launched from, the Empire Lawrence, was finished off by torpedoes that same day. After the explosion, almost nothing was left of her. By the report of one of the officers who took part in the rescue, all that floated on the water was a lattice gangway and a few scraps of wood. On the 18th of September that year, convoy PQ-18, 40 merchant ships, was steaming under almost constant air attack, and 13 of them would never reach the Soviet ports. It was in the thick of that battle that a flyer named Burr was launched from the same Empire morn. German torpedo bombers came in on the convoy wave after wave. Burr shot down one Heinkel and knocked another out of the fight, breaking up the attack before it could do the convoy serious harm. Then came the harder part of the task, the part almost no one tells. The fighter had just enough fuel for the fight, not for a long flight. To ditch in the middle of the Barents Sea meant near certain death from the cold, long before a rescue ship could reach him. Burr turned his machine south and flew it through the fog nearly 240 miles to the Soviet airfield at Keg-Ostrov. The Hurricane was built for a few minutes of combat beside a ship. 240 miles of fog over the sea on the last drops of fuel was in no one's design. Burr flew them at the limit of the machine and of his own nerve. On the 1st of November 1942, in convoy HG-91, homeward bound from Gibraltar, it was the Empire Heath's turn. To intercept a Condor, they launched a pilot named Norman Taylor, by then already an experienced fighter with several victories to his name won long before his transfer to this unit. Taylor caught the reconnaissance aircraft and shot it down. It was the 7th victory of his flying career, but the first and only one won from the catapult of a merchant ship. The joy of it did not last long. As he bailed out, the parachute harness cut into his shoulder and neck, his life jacket refused to inflate, and the rigging lines tangled his legs. He could not free his dinghy either. A pilot who could not swim found himself alone with the Atlantic on the edge of drowning. The corvette Sweetbriar picked him up at the last moment. Taylor was returned to the Empire Heath, the very ship he had launched from less than an hour before. Living proof that in this program the danger waited both in the sky and in the water beneath it. The geography of these launches alone shows the scale of the problem. The Maplin covered the Atlantic convoy OG-70, headed toward Gibraltar. The Empire Morn went into action twice in Arctic waters, in convoys bound for Murmansk and back. The Empire Lawrence met its fate in the same place, off Bear Island. The Empire Heath covered an entirely different route, the southern Gibraltar convoy HG-91. The Empire Darwin, 2 years on, fought in a wholly different part of the world, homeward bound from Sierra Leone off the coast of West Africa. The gap in the sky did not sit at one point on the map. It ran from the Arctic ice to the warm waters off the coast of Spain, and the catapult Hurricane was needed at every point along that line all the same. Over the whole history of the program, a fighter was launched from the catapult of a merchant ship 9 times. From those 9 sorties, the pilots had 9 German aircraft destroyed to their credit, with several more damaged or driven off without a decisive fight. And now, set that number beside another. 9 machines shot down over 2 years of the whole program, against more than 85 merchant ships sent to the bottom by Condors alone in the first half year of their unopposed hunting. 9 fires on the water against a whole fleet of cargo ships gone under in a single winter. On the scales of plain arithmetic, one did not come close to covering the other, and by that arithmetic, the program looked almost useless. But the real effect was not in the tally of victories, it was in what happened before any fight at all. The German crews, catching the flash of a rocket launch on the horizon, would turn and pull away at low level, cutting off their watch on the convoy before they could pass the exact coordinates. An aircraft that almost never opened fire still changed the enemy's behavior every time it appeared. From the middle of 1941, the command was already ordering Condor crews to avoid air combat and preserve the aircraft for long-range reconnaissance, where their range stayed irreplaceable. The reason was simple. There were desperately few Condors. Only around 270 were built over the whole war, a few dozen a year, and each such machine was valued at headquarters above any single convoy it was shadowing. The order to preserve them meant that even a hint of a fighter on the horizon was worth turning away for, worth taking the precious reconnaissance machine home. That caution spread to the catapult launches themselves. A single rocket flash on the horizon was enough to turn a Condor away, without even finding out whether a real fighter had risen from the doomed ship. This was not a run of breakdowns and bad luck that dogged the program from ship to ship. This was a weapon built to write itself off every time, even when it won. And that is exactly why it worked. If this look at the story interests you, leave a like and subscribe. Still ahead in this video, the few seconds inside the cockpit right before launch that almost never get described, and where this whole program went in the end, once the need for it was gone. What happened in those seconds is almost never written down in the official reports. The pilot on watch climbed into the cockpit the moment the alarm sounded, before the enemy even showed on the horizon, and waited for the order to launch. The training course ashore had prepared him for the load of the launch. For the main thing, it could not prepare him. Between the alarm and the order to launch, minutes went by, sometimes longer. The pilot sat strapped into the cramped cockpit right on the bow of the ship, looking at the short stretch of rails ahead and the grey water beyond them, and knew that in a minute those rails would end and the open ocean would be under him. Behind him lay the ship he was attached to. A bunk, a table, the faces of the men he had shared the voyage with week after week. All of it he was seeing for the last time, before he had even moved. Every pilot of this unit knew in advance that whatever happened in the air a minute from now, he would not be able to return to this deck. The other fighters of the war came back to their airfields if they won the fight, or even just survived it. Here, the outcome of the fight decided only one thing: where in the cold water the man would end up, and how quickly they could pull him out. Not every launch ended in death, but everyone began with a goodbye to this ship, and the pilot knew it while he sat and waited for the charge to go off under the deck. The first truly full answer had come earlier, and it cost no less than the disposable hurricanes. The Audacity had been converted from a captured German cargo ship into Britain's first escort carrier. She sailed on her first voyage in September of 1941, carrying fighters that could take off and land on her deck again and again on the same voyage. The result was beyond comparison with the tally of the whole catapult program. Over 3 voyages, from September to December, the Audacity's fighters shot down 7 Condors, more than the catapult hurricanes off the merchant ships took in 2 years of the whole war. One Gibraltar convoy, at the end of October, brought 4 victories in a single voyage. The most successful Condor hunter among the Audacity's flyers on that cruise was a young pilot named Eric Brown, known in the fleet as Winkle, who put 2 of them on his tally. Ahead of him lay a long career as a test pilot that would enter the history of aviation, but it began here, over the convoys off Gibraltar, on a deck a few dozen meters long. On the 21st of December that year, in convoy HG-76, a German submarine torpedoed the Audacity. The aviation fuel caught fire, the bow was torn away, and the carrier went down in under an hour. The reusable fighter had proved far more effective than the disposable one, but the real solution sank along with the single ship that embodied it at that moment. To bring enough of these ships into service to cover every convoy took nearly another year and a half. And here is where an object appears that finally struck out the whole calculation of the German crews. While the Condors worked on the assumption that there was nothing to fill the British sky over the middle of the ocean, American shipyards began sliding escort carriers down the ways by the dozen, one after another. At the peak of the effort, one such ship touched the water almost every week. A small, flat hull with a flight deck, assembled on a line by the same logic used to build freighters and tankers, and it was an answer the Condor had not expected and could not have imagined. Behind a single, desperate hurricane on a catapult, there now rose a whole industry, stamping out decks of fighters faster than the enemy could sink them. The German machine was built one at a time, a few dozen a year, and guarded like a treasure. The American escort carrier was an expendable unit of a factory line. The empty sky the enemy had counted on so heavily was now being filled by a plain fact. The factories on the other side of the ocean could make these ships faster than they could be sent to the bottom, and lone heroism off a merchant deck was no longer required for it. By the spring of 1943, enough real escort carriers had come into service to keep a full fighter screen over every major convoy, able to launch and land as many times as needed, not just once. On the 8th of June 1943, the command of Royal Air Force Fighter Command gave the order to disband the Merchant Ship Fighter Unit. But there were still ships at sea whose voyage was not finished, and an order on paper did not mean the instant end of the program on the water. On the 28th of July 1943, after that order, convoy SL-133 was steaming home from Sierra Leone with the last 2 catapult ships on the route, the Empire Darwin and the Empire Tide. That day, both ships launched their fighters against Condors. Flyer Jimmy Stewart from the Empire Darwin shot one down and was picked up by the sloop Enchantress. Flyer Flynn from the Empire Tide damaged a second Condor and was returned to service aboard the sloop Leith. It was the last air fight in the whole history of the program, and it ended just as the whole story had begun. A victory bought with a disposable aircraft and the man inside it. The formal end came on the 7th of September 1943, when the last unit was disbanded. The disposable fighters, which Britain herself had called a temporary stopgap on the very day they appeared, had done their work and were no longer needed. Over 2 years, 35 converted ships passed through the program, and of them 12 were lost themselves, some never getting the chance to send their single fighter into the air. Of those that did launch, not one came home to its ship, That was how it had been meant from the start. The Condors, which in 1940 and 1941 had treated the middle of the Atlantic as their own private sky, were forced by 1943 to stay high, to avoid lone ships, and to give up the precise guidance of the submarines at the first sign of a rocket launch. The German crews flew skillfully enough for this theatre of the war. What undid them was the belief that this emptiness in the sky could never be filled, and by nothing. It took a single aircraft on a deck, known in advance to be one that would not return, to prove that belief wrong. Robert Everett, the flyer whose shots on the 3rd of August 1941 became the first victory of a rocket-launched fighter in the history of air combat, lived through that day. He climbed out of a sinking cockpit several meters underwater, was picked up by a destroyer, and received the Distinguished Service Order. On the 26th of January 1942, less than 6 months after that fight, Everett took off almost routinely. An ordinary ferry flight of a fighter from Belfast to Abingdon, the kind of routine work military pilots do by the hundred over a career. Over Red Wharf Bay, off the island of Anglesey, the engine began to miss, and the Hurricane lost height. The machine was found in the water about 150 meters from shore, the cockpit empty, the harness undone. Everett's body was washed ashore only several months later. The post-mortem found that he had drowned. The man who had volunteered for a mission designed to have no way back, and had won it, died on a ferry flight of the kind you almost always come home from. He was buried in the churchyard of St. Donna's at Llandonna, beside the water that took him in the end. Here is a number that turns over everything already said. Of the 9 pilots launched into a fight in the air, not one came back to his original ship. That is true. But of those 9, 8 lived. Kendal was killed by his own parachute, opening too late. The name one-way ticket was literally true in only one sense. The ticket was one way as far as that particular ship. As a one-way ticket out of life, it almost never was. Hay survived the icy water of the Barents Sea and nearly 2 years of war after it. He was killed over Normandy on a ground attack sortie in a Typhoon fighter in 1944, and is buried in France, in the war cemetery at Saint-Désir. Taylor, a Battle of Britain veteran before his transfer to the catapult unit, came through the whole war and died only after it in 1948 in Germany. Here lay the strange arithmetic of this program. The ship almost certainly lost its single fighter on every combat launch. The pilot almost certainly lived. The machine was written off in advance and never expected back. The man in it was not meant to be written off, and was hauled from the water with every means the convoy had. The only disposable thing in that pairing was the machine, and the seat in its cockpit was filled by volunteers who went into the risk with open eyes. The pilots prepared for a likely death on that particular flight. Almost all of them, instead, came back to service alive. Death caught up with some of them at another time and in another way, in a war far longer than one doomed launch off a merchant deck. Not Kendal, not Hay, not Burr, not Taylor, not Stewart, not Everett knew in advance what the outcome of their own flight would be. They knew only one thing before they ever climbed into the cockpit. Whatever happened next, they would not be landing back on this ship. The German staffs, reading the reports of one more Condor shot down or driven off, saw in it an unfortunate stroke of chance, an affordable price for a dominance that still remained theirs. Their miscalculation lay deeper than the question of who was stronger in the air. They had counted the gap empty too long, so empty by their conviction that no one would ever dare to close it, and by nothing, not even at the price of a single doomed aircraft. Britain never did get a better fighter against the Condors. She did something else. She bought time until the real solution arrived, paying for it with aircraft written off the very moment they were placed on the catapult, and with men who knew this in advance and took the seat in the cockpit all the same. Every such aircraft the German staff entered in the log as a chance recoverable loss. Enough chances added up to exactly the number needed, so that by 1943 the sky over the middle of the Atlantic no longer belonged to those who had once counted it their own.